Today's Wednesday, April 5, I almost said May this time, and we stopped at this slide before, so I just wanted to kind of start here again as a quick refresher, talking about some definitions. And so one of the things is when we're talking about, we have heard the term hilum before. For example, we have a hilum in the kidney, so that's that little indented portion where the renal artery, vein, and other structures like nerves or the ureter exits. So it's this indentation. Also have that same kind of structure, that indentation, the hilum in the lymph node. And so you also have hilum in the respiratory system. And so the hilum you find within each lobe of the lung, where you have the bronchi and the vessels entering in to each lobe. So each lobe has a hilum involved. Okay, so looking more in depth at the lower respiratory tract, once you get to the base of the trachea and where it splits to the right bronchus or the left bronchus, remember that split, that little point where it splits is called the carina. But so it splits to the right side and to the left. So the very first split that carries all the air to the right side is going to be your right primary bronchus. The split that takes all the air to the left side will be your left primary bronchus. And then they branch into smaller and smaller branches to conduct air to all of the respiratory surfaces. Okay, so notice they branch and they get smaller and smaller. When they get small enough, instead of being a bronchi, we call it a bronchiole because it's smaller. And so, important thing to remember that the only place where gas exchange can occur is across that respiratory membrane, which is in the alveoli. So all of these tubes, the bronchioles, the bronchi, gas exchange that cannot occur there. It is strictly conduction of air. So remember, Monday we talked about the conduction portion and the respiratory portion. Almost the entire respiratory system is a conducting portion where you're conducting air. And then the very last little bit, the little tube that leads to the alveoli, that's where gas exchange occurs, okay? We have discussed this before, and it's good to remember. So with any conducting tube within the respiratory tract, is going to be lined with mucous membrane. So for a quick reminder, what kind of cell makes mucus? Yeah, you guys will hopefully remember that for the rest of your life. Okay, and so mucous membranes are found with epithelial cells. Anybody remember what's the epithelial cell that's lining your trachea, for example? The bronchi? Not that one. This is one where you have that mucus escalator in your it's your ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. Yeah, it's the big, long one. But the cilia helps move the mucus up and out. And what was the purpose of the mucus? Do you remember in the respiratory tract? To be trapping particles, things that don't belong. Okay, it could be dust. It could be a pathogen. It could be pollen. So it traps it and it kind of carries it up that mucus escalator and up and out. Okay? So the cells, the mucous membrane, it's all very important with the respiratory system. And so here's another good picture showing you kind of close up, showing you that ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And so the part that I didn't put in is pseudostratified. Ooh, okay. And so that mucus that's going to be kind of on the surface of the cilia. Okay, you see the cilia? Oh, the lovely cilia. The cilia is going to move the mucus up and out. It's there to trap, like we just said, so trapping particles, microorganisms, keeping them out of the very, very delicate respiratory zone where you have those alveoli, which are just one cell thick, the simple squamous epithelial cells. A good advantage of having these pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells in the conduction portion of the respiratory system helps ensure that pretty much nothing is going to be able to pass from the center of, let's say, your trachea all the way through into your tissue, because the cell layer is so thick that it makes it pretty much impossible for diffusion to occur. Okay, so looking at the lungs, you do need to know how many lobes you have on either side, the right or the left side. So lungs, yes, they're divided into lobes, and they're not equal. Okay, so looking at this picture here, so first of all, is this the right side or the left side? Good, yes, you put yourself in the picture. So this is the right side, and then this is our left side. Now let's embrace the R. Let's just put the right over here. So how many lobes do we have on the right side? 3. Okay, and so notice they're labeled up here. So this is the superior lobe, middle lobe, and then what's the bottom one? Inferior. Now, on the left side, how many lobes do we have? So which lobe is missing? The middle. Okay, and we have this lovely little notch, our cardiac notch, and that is there for our heart, because remember, our heart lies on its right side, and it's more on the left side of the sternum. So you have that notch there to help make space for the heart. Okay, so each lobe has its own bronchus and vessel supply, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So each lobe is technically separate from the others, and that's a good thing. Okay, so for example, if someone does have a damaged or diseased lung, first of all, you can't just cut out that one little portion, because your lung is like a sponge. You guys have, some of you have felt the lungs. We've had respiratory, we had the lungs up here. We've had lungs with a cadaver. Some of you were in Wednesday lab and played around with the mink lungs. They're spongy, they're soft. And so those alveoli, so if we look at a cross-section right here, it literally looks like you made a cross-section of a sponge. So you have a whole bunch of open spaces. So if you cut part of the lung off, how are you going to seal off all of those open spaces? You can't. It's impossible. So what happens is typically, if you have a diseased portion of the lung, you'll have to remove the whole lobe. Otherwise, you are going to have, you can't heal. You can't, yeah, so you would need to replace the whole lobe. It's good to remember. And this little fact area here, why is it not drawing? About the lobes, the name of the lobes, how many on each side. Definitely you're going to need to know that. Okay, so each lobe, we already know, has its own air supply and blood supply. Okay, so each lobe is supplied with air from what we would call a secondary bronchi. The primary bronchi branches to the right or the left side, and then from there it branches further into what we call the secondary bronchi, which leads to each different lobe. Okay, and then from there, once you're in that lobe, the bronchi branch and get smaller and smaller, and so they'll branch into the segmental bronchi. Sometimes you can call it tertiary. I think on the next page, no, I'll have to draw it on the board. Okay. And so then they even can, these tertiary bronchi branch and branch until they get small enough where we call them bronchioles. Okay? And each lobe is essentially, it's like a sponge. It's pretty much hollow. The point is to inflate it with air. So one of your handouts on Moodle kind of breaks down the divisions of the different splits of the bronchi and the bronchioles. So real quick, we'll write on the board. We begin with the trachea. Hopefully I spelled that right. And then what are the two tubes? You know, one goes to the right, one goes to the left. What do we call those? Get off your cell phones. What do we call the tube that thank you. The tube that goes to the right side. We call it the right primary bronchi. Okay, so right primary. And then you get the same thing over here, but it's the left primary. So those go to each side. Now, when we branch to the different lobes, the primary bronchi branches into, what do we call it? Secondary bronchi. So let's see, the right side of the heart, how many lobes do we have? 3. So from the right primary bronchi, we actually divide it into 3. So I'm just going to kind of show it like that. And so we call those the secondary bronchi. And those go to each lobe. Okay? So we have 3 of those on the right. And then on the left, how many do we have? We have 2 secondary. Oh, they're practicing the tornado drill. 2 secondary bronchi, because we only have 2 lobes on the left side. From there, so those lead to each individual lobe, and then, so within an individual lobe, those bronchi start branching more. So secondary bronchi branch into what? Tertiary. And then from there, it branches even smaller into bronchioles. Okay. And so, yes, you have tertiary bronchi on both sides. And then bronchioles. So, I made a handout that kind of shows you the breakdown of the tubes and the names of them, and it's on the handout on Moodle. So I would encourage you to look at that. It hopefully will be helpful for you. Okay, just to kind of get an idea of the organization. It's all on one page and much more organized than this. Okay? All right, so the bronchi branch and branch and branch, and they get smaller until they turn into bronchioles. And then, once they're small enough, you finally have reached that respiratory zone. In the respiratory zone, we have just a couple structures. So, first of all, the conducting zone. So, hold on. Here. Conducting zone ends with terminal bronchioles. I know, this is getting... So everything and above is conducting, okay? Your conducting zone. So, but from those terminal bronchioles, it branches even further. And so I'm going to move back over here. Okay, I'm going to put terminal bronchioles. So this is the last part of the conducting zone. When those branch, it branches into, what do we call them? Respiratory bronchioles, okay? And then the respiratory bronchioles lead to your alveoli. So these 2 sections are part of your respiratory zone. Just those 2. Okay, everything above it is your conducting zone. Okay? And so we have talked about the anatomy of the alveoli before. They're little sacs. They kind of look like grapes. I know I always say that. But the balloon-like, grape-like structure increases the surface area. And remember, it's made of our simple squamous epithelium. So it's designed for good, easy diffusion of gases across that membrane. Okay, So looking closer, I really love this picture. It shows us kind of what the alveoli look like. It shows part of the capillary bed surrounding it, which we have a very good blood supply to our lungs. We've already kind of discussed that, how important the relationship is between the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. Okay, so those respiratory bronchioles lead to the alveoli. Okay, remember those two are part of the respiratory zone. So if we look at this picture here, shows our little alveoli. They're little bubbles. If you cut the bubble, then it looks like a sponge. Okay, and so those are the little alveolar sacs. That's where gas exchange occurs. It's 1 cell thick, and in reality, all of these alveoli are surrounded by capillary beds. Okay, and it is there for gas exchange. Okay. Interestingly enough, it does take effort to inflate your lungs, to inflate the alveoli, those little sacs. You want to inflate them, then you can have some good, efficient gas exchange. But you don't have to spend any energy exhaling. Okay? That's a passive process. Inhaling requires energy, requires an active process. It's either conscious or unconscious, but you're going to inhale air to fill up those alveoli. So remember, when we inhale, our diaphragm is contracting and it flattens down, which makes more space in our thoracic cavity, so it basically sucks the air in. But when the diaphragm relaxes, it kind of bounces back up into the thoracic cavity and helps push the air out. So we have some elasticity there. You don't have to use any energy to push the air out of the alveoli, okay? Oops, wrong way. All right, we have talked about the surface area of the alveoli. There's a massive amount of surface area within your lungs for gas exchange. And so that shape we've discussed again, yes, does increase the surface area. And, I was right. So if you were able to spread out the entire respiratory membrane, it could take up the entire space of a tennis court, which is a lot if you've ever been out on a tennis court. That's a lot of space. So it's maximizing the surface area, maximizing the amount of oxygen, carbon dioxide that can be diffused across. So the more oxygen you can get, the better. So surface area increases that ability. Let's see. Yes, we already knew all that. Okay, so control of the lungs and some of the functions. Okay, so our lungs, breathing, by the way, can be conscious and unconscious. Okay, you can think about it and actively breathe in air, exhale air, but if you're not thinking about it, then the respiratory system and the nervous system takes over and stimulates that breathing itself. So the phrenic nerve, for example, innervates the diaphragm and tells it to contract and relax when you're not thinking about breathing. Okay, so within the lungs, we have autonomic control, which means that's without our effort, we can't, it just happens. Okay, and this regulates the smooth muscle we find in the lungs. So remember those smaller bronchioles, we mentioned they were surrounded by smooth muscle. They can control the flow of air in and out of that respiratory zone. And so if, for example, the smooth muscles relax, we have what's called bronchodilation. So that means, let's say a bronchiole or whatever was this narrow, bronchodilation would make it larger. Okay? Doing that, that's going to allow more air to pass through those passageways, and this is when you're more active and you're needing more air, more oxygen to supply energy to your muscles. So notice this is caused by the sympathetic division of the nervous system, which again is that fight or flight response. So it makes sense you're going to dilate those bronchioles so you can get more air. On the other hand, you can have bronchoconstriction, and that is where the smooth muscles surrounding those little bronchi constrict. So you basically have the opposite, where you've had a wider diameter and it goes to a smaller diameter. That's going to control the flow of air, actually decrease the flow of air, and it is controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. So bronchodilation is controlled by the sympathetic division. Bronchoconstriction is controlled by the parasympathetic division. Okay, so just remembering parasympathetic is the rest and digest section of the nervous system, and sympathetic, you guys remember that. What is that over? Or what does it control? Sympathetic division. This is where it's the fight or flight response. Okay, you guys remember this. We have a final coming soon. Okay. Sometimes with the bronchoconstriction, you can have substances that trigger the bronchoconstriction. So for example, allergies can trigger bronchoconstriction, especially if you're allergic to something or highly allergic. Those bronchioles will get constricted, and that leads to you have more difficulty breathing. It could be asthma. If the allergic reaction is strong, it can completely close the airways, and somebody is at risk for dying if they don't get those dilated. So real quick, if they're constricted, the reason why, what do they usually give people who are having like anaphylactic shock and they can't breathe? Epinephrine. Epinephrine is triggered to be released by the sympathetic nervous system. So if you are giving someone who has bronchoconstriction epinephrine, you're basically giving them a boost of the hormone that's released by the sympathetic nervous system, which will cause bronchodilation. Okay, direct relationship there. All right, so a little bit more about asthma. We have talked about it before. This is where that bronchoconstriction is too much. Okay, and it causes breathing problems, short of breath, wheezing. It can very severely restrict airflow. Asthma can be very severe, from minor to severe. Okay, we have these structures within the lungs called trabeculae, and we've talked about trabeculae before when we talked about the anatomy of the lymph nodes, for example, is that connective tissue kind of covering of the organ, and then it kind of branches in within that structure and creates all these little branches inside. So those little branches that are coming from the outside capsule that kind of infiltrate the organ and create all these little spaces, those are the trabeculae. So it's made of connective tissue. What you'll find there is that, so for example, those trabeculae divide the lobes into smaller and smaller compartments, just like the trabeculae in a lymph node divides up the lymph node into smaller compartments and flows the flow of lymph that goes through there. You kind of have that same structure, so you're dividing these lobes into smaller and smaller sections, which assists with the air, with the function of the lungs. And note, you also find within the trabeculae lymphatic vessels. Why would we need lymphatic vessels in the lungs? Yeah, there's a lot of blood going through there. So if there's a lot of blood passing through your lungs all the time, which is true, what happens in the capillaries? We have plasma, the fluid that's exiting the capillaries and going into the tissue fluid. It has to do it in the lungs too. So we need a way to collect that extra tissue fluid. So lymphatic vessels are found everywhere. And in fact, just recently, within the last year, anatomists discovered a very intricate system of lymphatic vessels within our brain that they did not know about until about a year ago, which is amazing. So they're still making discoveries, anatomical discoveries of the human bodies. We still have not found it all and figured it all out. Okay, so a little bit more about the lungs. So within the alveoli, within that respiratory membrane, those little bubbles, you have different types of cells within that. We talked about the alveolar macrophages on Monday. Then you also have what's called a pneumocyte type 1 and a pneumocyte type 2. Okay? Now, we've already talked about the macrophages, so I want to spend a moment talking about the nematocytes type 2. These cells are the ones that produce surfactant, and surfactant is a very important kind of oily substance within the lungs, and it prevents the alveoli from sticking to itself. So if it deflates, those little thin membranes will stick to themselves. And then it'll be hard to reinflate because they're sticking together. So the surfactant helps prevent them from sticking together, so when you breathe, the alveoli are able to fill up. So surfactant is very important in your ability to actually inflate your lungs, and so helps the alveoli from sticking together. Babies or fetuses, for example, don't start producing surfactant until the mid portion of their third trimester. So this is one of the reasons for, let's say, if a baby is born too early, they have not produced enough surfactant. This is where they may have trouble breathing and getting enough oxygen. So thus, one of the reasons why we like to have babies develop full term, but treatment has improved dramatically for babies who are born early. I believe there's even a synthetic surfactant now that can be used to assist with the maturation of those lungs. Okay, so diffusion. So what's happening in the lungs itself across that respiratory membrane is diffusion. And the two main things we're looking for is diffusion of carbon dioxide out of the lungs and then out of the body when you exhale, and then diffusion of oxygen into the lungs, into the bloodstream. Okay? So the diffusion of those gases is short because the wall of those alveoli is one cell thick. It's a simple squamous epithelium. So it's a very small distance to diffuse across. And what's super helpful is that these gases are lipid soluble, so they can diffuse. They don't need a protein channel. They just pass right on through that phospholipid bilayer of the cell. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about a few disorders. One example is pneumonia. I'm sure some of you have had that wonderful experience at some point in your life. This is where a lobe or more than one lobe is inflamed. Fluid leaks into those lobes, into the alveoli, so it's filling up the spaces that you would normally use to breathe. And so because there's fluid in there, you can't use that for gas exchange. So it severely limits how much air you can breathe, because part of your lungs is filled with fluid, and that's bad. Okay, and so if you have fluid in the alveoli, the respiratory membrane is not going to work. You're not going to have diffusion, and typically what occurs when you do have fluid building up in your lungs due to pneumonia is that you will have to have it drained. And I worked for a while in the St. Helena Hospital near PUC, and I got to see a giant glass vial that was brought down from a patient who just had his lungs drained. And it was gross, I'm not going to lie. And it was a giant. He had a ton of fluid. And yes, so pneumonia can be very serious. Okay, so talking about blood supply, we've talked about from the right side of the heart, blood leaves the heart, goes to the pulmonary trunk, and then branches to the right and left. And so blood leaving the heart, does it leave through veins or does it leave through arteries? Arteries. So your pulmonary arteries are bringing oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. Okay? And so those branch, and so each artery you have, or an arteriole, goes to each lobe so that you can have the gas exchange occur. Okay, so we have talked about the pulmonary circuit before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this idea of, so blood from the right side of the heart goes to the lungs, you have gas exchange, and then the blood returns back to the left side of the heart and then goes to your systemic circuit. Okay? As you saw in that picture before, the little alveoli and then the capillaries surrounding it, all of those alveoli have a capillary network surrounding it. And that, again, is to maximize the amount of diffusion that's occurring and the amount of oxygen that you're going to be able to get. Okay. So gas exchange, there's two types of respiration, and you definitely need to know these two types. The first is external respiration, and this is the part where you're breathing air in. It goes through these passageways, and so it's traveling through all these passageways. It gets to the respiratory zone, and you have diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide, okay? Internal respiration is completely different. This is once you have the oxygen in your blood, bound to your hemoglobin, then we're starting to talk about internal respiration, where that oxygen is traveling throughout your bloodstream and then is given off to individual cells that are needing more oxygen. So internal respiration is with each individual cell in your body, okay? And if we want to think about it, internal respiration is essential in the process of cellular respiration, okay? Because this is how we get the oxygen we need for cellular respiration, is gas exchange with each individual cell in your body. Okay, so 3 processes of external respiration. So this stuff on the board we talked about, the conduction and the respiratory portion. So gas is moving across. First you have breathing. So we call that pulmonary ventilation. So you are getting air into your lungs. Okay. The second stage is gas diffusion, diffusing across the respiratory membrane, which is in the alveoli. So you're having gas exchange that occurs there. Once gas exchange occurs, you have this nice fresh oxygen that is now in your bloodstream. And so the third portion of that is you're transporting oxygen throughout the tissues, or you also have to transport carbon dioxide and get it out to the lungs for exchange. Okay? So transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide happens in the blood. Okay? And this happens between, those capillaries that surround the alveoli, so the diffusion and the transport occurs there, and then once it's in the blood, then goes to the other tissues. Okay? Okay, pulmonary ventilation a little bit more. This is just, again, what's the previous slide? Breathing. That's really all you need to know. Your air moving in and out of your lungs, okay? And so when air is moving in, you're ventilating, you're filling up those alveoli, gas exchange occurs, and then you exhale. So it's really simple, breathing in and out, okay? Now, the role of the pressure, atmospheric pressure, we've talked about this in lab before, about how you basically have a negative pressure within your thoracic cavity. So, also talking about concentration gradients, we can talk about a gradient between the pressure outside your body and the pressure inside your thoracic cavity. And so air is going to flow from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. And so within your thoracic cavity, you have lower pressure inside your chest than you do outside. So when you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts, it makes more space within your thoracic cavity, and so it therefore reduces the pressure inside the thoracic cavity, which essentially just causes the air outside that has more pressure just to flow right into your lungs because you have lower pressure there. Okay? So air is going to be flowing from areas of high pressure down to low pressure. You have lower pressure in your thoracic cavity, so air is going to go straight into there. Okay? So this picture is helpful because it kind of shows visually what's happening with the diaphragm when it contracts and when it relaxes. You also have some movement with the rib cage itself, and so you have your external and internal intercostals that assist with that movement. So when you are breathing, you have a respiratory cycle, you have inhalation and exhalation, the two major things that are happening, put the cell phones away, in the respiratory cycle. Okay? So when a person breathes in, that occurs because the diaphragm has contracted and it has flattened. So right, this picture here, whoops. So when the diaphragm contracts, it pushes down, it flattens out, and it creates more space within the thoracic cavity and a decrease in pressure. So because there's a decrease in pressure in the thoracic cavity, air just wants to go on in because the pressure is higher outside. Okay? Now, when you exhale, so this picture here, your diaphragm pushes back up more into the thoracic cavity. It pushes pressure on the lungs and helps expel air. Okay? And you also have the thoracic cavity itself kind of decrease in size, and that has to do with your intercostal muscles and how they're functioning. So when you breathe in, not only does the diaphragm flatten, but the intercostal muscles in between your ribs contract and help lift up your rib cage a bit. So that helps to increase surface area even more. Okay? And when you breathe out, those intercostal muscles relax and the thoracic cavity actually decreases in size as well. Okay? So both the intercostal muscles and your diaphragm assist in this pressure difference, okay, and makes the pressure inside low, the air flows in, okay. So a little bit more about the muscles that are involved with respiration. We have talked about the diaphragm, and that has a very, very important role, okay. When it's contracted, it's flattened, it's increased the space in our thoracic cavity, therefore decrease the pressure inside so air flows in, okay? You have your external intercostal muscles of the ribs that help kind of raise the ribs up a bit to make more space in the thoracic cavity. And then there's some other muscles, we just call them accessory muscles, that also assist in the breathing process. So, talking about this bottom portion here, the difference between inhalation and exhalation, how much energy are we spending? Every time you inhale, you are using energy. So you inhale, you're contracting the diaphragm, which right away, that is using energy, it's using ATP. You also have your external intercostals and other muscles that are also working to increase the size inside the thoracic cavity. So inhalation is always active. Exhalation can be active or passive. So can you give me an example of just passive exhalation? Sitting here in the classroom right now, when you are breathing in and out, are you putting effort into exhaling? No. So it can be passive by simply the diaphragm, when it relaxes, it bounces back up into the thoracic cavity, pushes the air out of your lungs. That does not cause any energy to be used, okay? However, you can use energy to exhale as well. So a good example would be blowing up a balloon. You are using energy, forcefully exhaling, okay? So most of the time when you're not thinking about it, exhaling is a passive process, but it can be active depending on what you're doing, okay? All right, so this picture shows a little bit more. This top picture here, at least, shows side profile. We see our rib cage, and it shows our diaphragm. And so when you have those intercostal muscles and accessory muscles, they contract, they lift up the rib cage, and the diaphragm flattens out. And so both of those just make more space. And more space decrease the pressure inside, which means what? If you decrease the pressure inside your thoracic cavity, what's going to happen? Pressure is higher outside, pressure is low in your thoracic cavity. Air is going to go in. Okay, we got to remember that. So just note, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but the diaphragm is the major player in breathing. But we have 2 minutes, so don't you be putting stuff away yet. So the diaphragm, look at this, 75% of normal air. So it's responsible for 3/4 of the breathing that's occurring. You have those external intercostals we mentioned that help raise up the rib cage, which increases the volume inside the thoracic cavity. And then you have some accessory muscles. I'm really not going to ask you about your accessory muscles. The two main ones are your external intercostals and diaphragm. Those are the major players. Okay, different types of breathing. Quiet breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, and costal breathing. You're going to need to know those 3 different types of breathing. So I'm going to finish the slide. It's still not time for class to be over. Okay, so quiet breathing, the other term for that is eupnea. We're just going to stick with quiet breathing as our official term because I can't pronounce the other one very well. So this is where you're breathing in and out. So active inhalation. Remember, inhalation's always active, but then passive exhalation. So you're letting the diaphragm push out the air. Okay? Diaphragmatic breathing, this is deep breathing. So if any of you were in choir, you know how they tell you to breathe deep and use your diaphragm. And I remember going like, well, how do I know I'm using my diaphragm? Like, could you be more descriptive, please? So diaphragmatic breathing is deep breathing. So you're really using your diaphragm. And then last one for today, costal breathing. This is really shallow breathing, like when you're sleeping and you are basically using your intercostal muscles, okay, that are causing the rib cage to raise up or decrease in size. Okay, so we're stopping with that, and we'll start with slide 37 on Friday, and we'll start our new chapter on Friday as well. Okay, I'll get that up on Moodle for you.
Dr. Oat, was there a side sheet?
There